Welcome back to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. We're picking up our work this Wednesday morning and going back to our miscellaneous draft State Code of Ethics bill. And I'm glad to have Jay Johnson from the General Counsel from the administration here with us. So thanks for coming to tell us your thoughts on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for having me. I don't think I was in this committee last year at all. So thank you for having me. Jay Pershing Johnson, Governor Scott's legal counsel. So I appreciate the invitation. We actually have a nice working relationship, I think, with the Ethics Commission. We do our best to reach 100% compliance on the financial filings as it is that are required across the executive branch. Not sure we are 100% at this moment, but we certainly do what we can to prod our administration. And we support the Ethics Commission's efforts to bring additional ethics obligations to municipalities. It looks like in the current draft, it really contemplates county officers, I guess elected county officers. No opposition to that. The only thing I would note is sheriffs already have a financial disclosure requirement in Title 24. So I would just, want to be sure that there's no redundancy or conflict in those two, if you were to add sheriffs to this general ethics obligation. We also would just say that additional financial disclosures should be feasible and applicable to all branches, which I think you've made a little bit of an effort to take a look at. One caution would be that we've historically had in the governor's code of ethics is that the requirements, and I'm no judge of what you added, with respect to this point, but a caution would be that the requirements not be so onerous and unreasonable as to discourage those best qualified from serving as public officers. And that both the public and the private sectors of Vermont are healthier and more vibrant when individuals have hands-on knowledge and work experience in both of those sectors. So I think that, I think there's always this balance. And of course, I think the direction has been great to focus more on ethics and ethics obligations to create a body that has developed a lot of credibility at this point. But that you don't discourage people from becoming candidates simply because they feel like the burdens of disclosure are too great. Vermont's a very small state, and there's only so many people who are going to run in the first place. So that's the only other suggestion I would have is to avoid what might appear to be disclosures that would be targeted or perceived to weaponize the Ethics Commission, because I think this ultimately, we found, goes to the sort of the integrity and the viability of the Ethics Commission as a body. But I'm not saying that this does that. I'm just saying that those would be my cautions as we proceed with the development of this committee bill. The questions I have about the new disclosure requirements would really go more to the question of feasibility. So when you require a candidate to know the name or to disclose the names of clients who had business before any municipal or state office, department, or agency during the previous 12 months. And I believe that's a standalone clause now from the and names of clients from whom they received $10,000 or more. I guess my initial question would be, how would the candidate know that person appeared before, had business before a municipal or state office, department, or agency? And where do you draw that line? So if a person went to DMV for a license, that would be business before a state entity. Permitting, maybe that's what you're trying to get at. So what exactly would the candidate be expected to know, right? So say any of you, you've run, I don't know what you know about your donors. I don't know how you would ferret out that information. But I think that that's just a worthwhile consideration. The other would be, what about professionals bound by confidentiality obligations? Not healthcare professionals, lawyers, others who are bound by their confidentiality obligations to not disclose the names of clients. So that would be another question. and again, it's sort of this line drawing. What do you consider to be business before any municipal or state office, department, or agency? I mean, what if a person closed on a home who happens to be a client of a barber and they had to have their deed filed with the clerk? Like, is that business before municipality? I don't know. Does it mean that they have to appear before a select board and request some kind of, I don't know, an interest, express an interest in a certain outcome? So anyway, those are just the kinds of questions I would have. The other would be, it does appear that the way that your disclosure regarding individual stock holdings or investments would mean just that, individual stock holdings or investments, but I don't know, but it's something to think about. Do you need additional clarity that the intent here is to accept out holdings in, say, retirement accounts and mutual funds? That's, just again, a question it raised for me. This provision regarding loans made to a company if the candidate owned more than 10% of that company and the loan was not commercially reasonable and made in the ordinary course of business. I just don't know what that means. And I don't know if that's intended to get at the Du Bois situation again, the one we have litigated and relitigated. But I feel like it's a disclosure issue. What does this was not commercially reasonable mean and made in the ordinary course of business? What if the argument is you're selling your share of a small business in Vermont, and the only way to finance it is to take a note, which is what happened in when the governor sold his business when he was elected to become governor. That became the issue. Well, now he has an interest. But it was the only way to sell the company, which was a promise he made to the voters if he was elected. So at what point that's just another question I would ask. What is it exactly that you're trying to get out there? And there is a provision that you've added to the in-office ethics requirements, which would be creating a conflict would include creating or permitting to persist any unlawful employment practice pursuant to 21 VSA 495. So this would presumably be people who employ state employees at the legislative level or the judiciary or the executive. But there are processes now for addressing these claims, right? People make complaints and they're addressed. It's a post adjudication idea? Like, do you need to have, or is this just a complaint made against a commissioner in an agency, right? Those things are kind of litigated all the time. Sometimes litigated, sometimes adjudicated. And there's a finding, there's an investigation, there's a determination. What will you require on that? Just were there complaints made? I don't know what you mean there. So that's just another consideration. Lastly, we do have a couple of suggestions that we had sort of come up with when we compared. So what we did in the governor's office, the governor has an executive branch code of ethics, which applies to all appointees and exempt government officials. So appointees of appointees. So it's kind of like it's not just the commissioners and secretaries and the deputies. It filters down into the lawyers and the other exempt staff on the office of an agency or a department. And we require financial disclosure biannually now. So that's on top of the Ethics Commission annual disclosure for just elected statewide, the commissioners, the secretaries, and the deputies. And we found that when we went through our code of ethics to conform it to the new ethics law, there are several areas where our code of ethics is more, I guess you might say, stringent in certain areas. And I would just maybe suggest a couple of things that we noticed when we went through it that our executive branch officials are currently required to comply with. We have a broader definition of person, I think is the term you use. And we call it a private entity, and you may or may not need this. It may be inclusive in the way that the law works, but we specifically include partnerships, joint ventures, whether organized for profit or nonprofit. So we clarify to a certain extent that that's across the board, when it comes to, the application of the analysis of whether there are conflicts. We require already, all public servants to promote a workplace free from sexual harassment and take quick and effective action to ensure sexual harassment does not occur or persist. That's in our code now. We require sexual harassment, racial equity, and implicit bias training for all public servants, in addition to ethics training. We require all public servants to be in good standing in regards to taxes and child support. We prohibit all public servants from taking any official action which materially advances the interest of any person with which the public servant is actively seeking employment. And then we actually prohibit gifts regardless of the current safe harbor provisions, regardless of value and circumstances, when the gift, and this is a fact, determination, when the gift may be reasonably implied or inferred to influence official action, or when a donor is seeking business. So that's those are the provisions we have in there that we had identified when we sought to conform, and realized that there were certain areas where ours were a little bit more, I wouldn't say stringent necessarily or harsh. I would just say they just add these extra layers for compliance purposes. So I don't know if you have any questions for me.
So you gave us a lot to think about. I kind of wanted to just tick off and make sure I caught many of the things that you were asking us to look into a little further,
Okay.
and then some of the recommendations you made, I think.
And I can provide that to you in writing.
Oh, that would be really great if you could put that in writing. I think that we did address the redundancy around the disclosure with the sheriffs, but we'll confirm that.
Okay.
I wanted to talk with you a little bit about something that had come up in our committee discussions around, discouraging people from serving because of what they have to disclose. And I think that that's, something that's one of the big policy things for us to wrestle with, is the balance between how much do we ask people to disclose to make sure the public interest is met in terms of what potential conflicts would be, versus, having it be so much that, somebody running for, if we're going to have parity and everybody across the branches is going to do the same thing, which I think is your overarching
Yes.
ask of us, is that we make sure it's the same for everybody, right?
Yeah.
So if we're going to do that, then making sure that if you're running for the state legislature, for instance, that the disclosure requirements are things that, candidates for the state legislature feel like are reasonable asks for them.
Right. That's right. Yep.
Am I understanding?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Have there been any, on the executive branch side, I mean, you all appoint people to office. It's different than running for election, right?
Mhm.
Have there been instances where the financial disclosures that we have currently have, been a barrier to somebody seeking office,
So for
or?
appointees, the only state, so there's the financial disclosures right now for in office apply to statewide, elected statewide, and secretaries, commissioners, and their deputies. So we have never had somebody object to filing or discourage them from stepping up to be candidates for those particular offices. And I think the same is, so then you go to the governor's code. So that's the state requirement. The governor's code is for all appointees of the governor. PUC has taken the view that they are not accountable to the governor. They maybe recently have changed their view of this, but historically have not filed a financial disclosure with the governor. But aside from that, every other appointed official does sign a financial disclosure. So and we have not had issues with that. So that's the thing. I think that we, more or less are successfully walking that line. That's why I would just, say that I'm happy that that's something that you're debating and thinking about as a policy matter.
Other questions for Jay? Go ahead.
I couldn't quite take notes quickly enough, but when you were speaking in the beginning, you said, you wanted to avoid disclosures that might appear to weaponize something, the client, or could you explain
Ethics
that?
Commission.
Oh, we weaponize the ethics commission,
Yeah.
right? Like, could you give an example of what that could look like?
Well,
Or
I mean, I'm guessing, maybe an example might be, and I'm not saying it is, it's just it's something you're still debating, you're still talking about, you're still considering. Targeted disclosures targeted, say, to individuals who you perceive to be problematic or groups that you perceive to be problematic. So that say this example was this loans made to a company if the candidate owned more than 10% of that company, and if the loan was not commercially reasonable and made in the ordinary course of business. Well, that definition is pretty material because I don't know what you mean by that. And is that intended to, at what point is the intent to capture a disclosure that is essentially targeting a person or a group of people that would reflect badly on them? I mean, and actually, I mean, that's what a lot of disclosure is, right? You're operating in the light of day. You're saying, I'm disclosing this and the voters will decide. And that's great. I mean, what you don't want is for people to not run because they think, everybody's going to take this the wrong way. They're not going to like the fact that I invested in X company or the fact that I made a loan that I thought was commercially reasonable, but now it turns out is not commercially reasonable according to the definition that the legislature has applied. Like that would mean that, I mean, so it all depends on how this evolves in the drafting, but that would be just this perception that somehow disclosures are targeted, again, to actually maybe discourage certain people from running for office or from succeeding if they do because of the nature of the disclosure that they're being asked to give. And I mean, the governor was fairly upfront when all of this was going on with Du Bois. He basically said, I'm willing to let the voters decide, right? He disclosed everything about the transaction. There was still an issue as to whether what his financial interest meant for purposes of, say, conflicts that somehow transferred to people in BGS, which would mean that everything eventually flows up to the governor, would make him impossible to do his job if every conflict was implied onto a state employee. So those kinds of changes aren't reasonable or helpful because what could have happened at that time, if there was a process for it, was full disclosure, recusal, a process for ensuring that no contracts with, a company that the governor was involved with would ever come before the governor or his senior staff for consideration, right? You develop process-oriented responses and recusal-oriented, which is the kind of response you've got in your ethics law now, right? People are expected to disclose and recuse. And that makes perfect sense. And if they don't recuse, they have to explain why they believe what they're doing or the position they're taking is really in the public interest and something they need to do for a number of exceptions that are in the statute. So that's all appropriate. That is the way that we should be handling ethics, conflicts of interest and avoiding conflicts of interest. But if you do something that creates, say, a per se conflict of interest, which no one could possibly ever get around, it's just, it creates this, I guess what I would call this weaponization of the law that's targeted toward certain kinds of candidates. And again, I'm not saying that this does that. I'm just saying that it should be clear that it doesn't do that.
And I wanted to ask a couple of quick clarifying questions about some of the suggestions that you made. So you talked about how there's the definition of person, that you've got a definition in the executive code that of private entity that we might want to take a look at.
Yes, I think that's
Isn't
right.
that correct?
Yeah. Right, so yeah, we have a broader definition of private entity. And again, your definition of person may be read more broadly, and that's possible. It's just that ours is more specific. We went with the list as opposed to the general.
What we typically hear from legislative counsel on our side is that person means, individual people, corporations, basically the whole gamut. When you see person in the law, it means all the stuff. So,
And I think that's probably, that is probably how a lot of people interpret it. It's just that the way we've done it makes clear that, like I said, it's a list. I'm not saying that's necessary, but again, it adds clarity.
and then you had touched on requirements around bias prevention, sexual harassment, pulling in those requirements, and also that there's mandatory training already on the executive branch.
Yes, yeah.
I think what we would think about here is we have some of those requirements, at least with the General Assembly on both the House and the Senate side, and are we being duplicative there if we try to bring them into the whole thing, or should we let everybody have sort of parallel training regime? So that's something for the committee to consider, but it's a welcome suggestion. And then you had I had just written that you had a specific suggestion about taxes and child support is already a requirement.
In our code.
In good standing.
Yeah.
Well, any other questions from the committee before let Ms. Johnson go?
Thank you. And I can send you this little list that we have put together, and you can take it or leave it.
Great.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much for your input on this.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
We've already collected a few suggestions for a future draft, so I think this may be the last day we take testimony with this initial draft that we put on the table, and then we'll try to get the next one, some of the things that we've heard so far. So we'll keep you posted on things, and if you have any future feedback or want to come before us, we'll probably be working on this for at least a couple more weeks before we try to get a consensus draft together.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for your work on this, and we certainly support the efforts to bolster the code of ethics for state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so I wanted to invite Executive Director Sibbert back, and their committee, there are several documents that are new handouts while making her way up for us to take a look at. I think this is the best one for us to have folks look at where would you like us to start, I guess?
That's a good question. And I guess, so two of them are companion pieces. So one is just kind of a breakdown of the language differences between the current law and the proposed law. And so that's just to kind of make it simple, just so people can see exactly what's changing. And then the other document is a more detailed explanation of the reason for the change and some explanation about how other states do it. So I'm not sure which would be most useful to start with. Maybe you pass.
That handout, that's the comparison between current law and proposed changes. I think that summarizes some of and may help clear up some of the confusion about what was in current law versus what's being proposed as new disclosure requirements. And I think that might be the best place to start. And then there's a chart. Yeah, there's a chart it's kind of green on one side and sort of peachy on the other with the changes highlighted.
So starting with that, so this is I just tried to make it quite easy to lay out exactly what would be changing between the current existing law and the proposed law. So all the changes are highlighted in yellow, as I can just go through quickly. Under who is required to disclose, the changes would be candidates for certain county offices, county treasurer, sheriff, and state's attorney. Under whose information would need to be disclosed. That stays the same. It's the filer, spouse, or domestic partner. The change here would be that the name of the spouse or domestic partner would be included in the form. The time period that is covered is the previous 12 months in both cases. Sources of income. So we're talking about sources of income of $5,000 or more. The change would be that it include client.
Just Representative Hango, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm I think you're going a little too fast for me. So I'm on the chart. And you are on which field of the
I
chart?
think she's looking at this one. Are you looking at
Oh,
that one? That looks
sorry,
like
wrong
that?
chart.
Yeah, looking at this.
Yeah, that would explain it. My
Yep.
apologies.
Yeah, because we'll get into the language one next. I wanted to start at the just conceptually, what's in, what's current, what's the new stuff, and I think this one does a good job of
Okay, thank you.
just making it really clear.
All right, so under sources of income, currently it's sources of income of $5,000 or more, and it includes employment income, the employer's name and address, if self-employed, a description of the nature of the self-employment, with no need to disclose client names, and investments that can be described generally as investment income. The changes would be the inclusion of the names of any clients who had business before any municipal or state office, department, or agency during the previous 12 months, and the names of clients for whom the candidate or candidate spouse or domestic partner has received $10,000 or more in the previous 12 months.
So before we move on from there, I think just after we heard the administration council's testimony, when we're talking about the meaning of who had business before, what are we trying to get at?
Sure, we're getting a situation where there's contracts or permitting, things like that. So we're not looking at, I think the example was like a barber's client, bought a house and needed to file the deed. That's not a situation we're looking at. So we're looking at more substantial business, not routine administrative tasks. And so I did address it. I submitted another document with some proposed changes that hopefully would get at some of the concerns. So the idea is that not you're investigating every client that you've ever had to see everything they've ever done, but we've included language that says business that is known to the filer, so that if you know that you have a particular client who has business before the state, then that's when you would disclose it. And also specify that information that is confidential under law does not need to be disclosed. That would be our suggestion for language changes for that section. And then the next change would be individual stock holdings or investments valued at $10,000 or more at any point in the previous months, losing my train of thought, but individual stock holdings or investments valued at $10,000 or more in any point in the previous 12 months shall be listed individually, as shall municipal bonds issued to the state of Vermont, regardless of total value. And so I think the question here, would you include retirement funds? My answer would be yes, because you can hold individual stocks in retirement funds. And, retirement funds theoretically are supposed to be used for retirement. Some people are close to retirement. Some people pull out of the retirement funds early. So yes, in that case, do you need to disclose mutual funds? I would say no. Positions on boards, commissions, other entities regulated by law. So the new language would just include boards or commissions or entities that make decisions about the allocation or disbursement of state funds, which is closed as a loophole. That's not specified in the current law. Company ownership.
Representative Hango's question.
I'm gonna ask a very specific example. Would this be something like if you sat on the board of United Way? Because they take disbursements from the state and allocate them to various programs that they run. And would that include domestic partner as well?
Yes.
And so I want to get at, so right now, to follow up on Representative Hango's question, if I was serving on the United Way board, which receives funds, United Way receives funds from the state, obviously, I would need to disclose that if I was serving. And this would add, I guess I'm wondering how the change works, because right now I need to report if I'm serving on that board.
Yeah.
Disclose it.
In this case, you already have to report it.
But you said yes to my inquiry of domestic partners or spouses.
Oh, apologies. No, in this case, it's just the officer.
Okay, so how is that a change from what we already are required?
So the highlighted language, it would be the change. So it says, or makes decisions about the allocation or disbursement of state funds. And so that's the language that would change. But under the current law, you have to disclose any entity that's regulated by law or that receives funding from the state. It doesn't specify that makes decisions about the allocation or disbursement of state funds. So this is just kind of closing the gap there. So you would already have to report that particular situation under the current law.
How is that different though? Just about any board? I mean, if you're listing all the boards, if I'm listing all the boards that I'm on, how is this different?
So am I understanding it correctly that it's the difference between receives funding from the state is current law, and then we're also saying if you're on a board that is in charge of deciding money that gets spent by the state, so it's adding a whole new group of boards to those you.
Like what? Can you give me an example? I'm not following you. Like, I'm already on a board that's receiving money from the state. So if it's receiving money from the state, if it's dispersing money, which is what you're adding, wouldn't it already be receiving money?
I mean, you could be on an advisory board or commission that is, giving advice on how state funds should be spent, not necessarily receiving it yourself and then dispersing it.
Like specific example, please?
TJ, do you want to give an example? Because I think you have all of these at the ready.
I'm struggling to come up with one off the top of my head in the state of Vermont. But in other states, there are innumerable boards that make both recommendations and make policy decisions on how the state should spend funds. In the state of Connecticut, by way of example, there's an advisory board with respect to healthcare, and the name escapes me right now. They receive no direct funds from the state, but they make recommendations as to how funds should be allocated by the in that case, the senior board that it receives the money and spends it. So you would have authority to influence the allocation of funds, even though the board itself would not be receiving funds from the state.
So essentially nothing in Vermont.
No, I think our general counsel has, and I could think of a few, but I didn't want to be testifying. Go ahead.
I'm just thinking of anything that the legislature has created that's advisory with respect to this. I mean, a really good example is the opioid settlement funds, which makes that they created a very large council that advises the Commissioner of Public Health on, on that person's ultimate recommendations to the legislature. So it's kind of, I think there might be other examples. I don't know about the Global Wellness Solutions Act Council. They make lots of recommendations about state policy and programming. And they actually don't report to the governor at all. So I mean, there are examples where some recommendations come directly to the legislature. So I think that that's pretty. So those are created in violence. I don't know how you're characterizing those.
That's what I'm trying to get at. Thank you.
So Director Sewer, this seems to me to be just kind of we're trying to get people when they're doing their disclosure to say what boards they serve on, whether it's one that's managing and receiving state funds or whether it's one that's advising on how those funds should be spent.
I'll say part of this, and with this particular example is we're closing a loophole, and we're also looking at, the language that is commonly used in other states and trying to round out what we're doing here with our disclosures.
Before we go too much further, if we could go back up to the previous example of a change highlighted, talking about individual stockholdings and investments valued at 10,000 or more at any point in the previous months. That's a little bit vague, and I'm wondering previous months.
It's 12 months in the statute, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So for the entire financial disclosure, you're looking back at the previous 12 months.
Okay, thanks.
So company ownership. Currently, you disclose companies in which the filer's spouse, or domestic partner, or both together own 10% or more. The change would be that companies in which the filer's spouse, or domestic partner, or both together own 10% or more, or had an ownership or controlling interest in any amount, and in the previous 12 months, the company had business with any municipal state office, agency, or department. So, any questions there? So essentially, you're just saying if you own a business that is doing business with the state, you have to disclose that business or municipality. Okay, loans are not addressed in the current financial disclosure requirements. The new requirement would be the details of any loan that is not commercially reasonable, where the loan is made to a company in which the filer, spouse, domestic partner has a 10% interest. And so what we're looking at there, so this is already addressed in the Code of Ethics under the gift rules. So this isn't an entirely new concept. We're talking about what is commercially reasonable, and in the ordinary course of business, what we're really getting at here is a situation where somebody is, essentially setting someone up to do them favors by offering them a much better interest rate than they could get anywhere else. So say the current interest rate is 5%, they're giving them a 0.5% interest rate. Say they're selling them a house and they're going to give them a loan for the house. They're, selling them the house at a lower rate or a lower price than would be, reasonable at the time period, and giving them a much better interest rate. So we're not talking about routine business, but we're talking about something that obviously is something that the person can access if they went out on the, regular commercial market to get that interest rate or to get that deal.
So I can think of a legislator that some of us know who recently sold a business, and in order to sell that business, there was no way that they were going to be able to sell it without holding a personal note. And so we're just asking that they disclose that kind of a loan. So they've essentially given a loan to the buyer. Would that be covered under this? Because in a sense, it's commercially reasonable. I mean, people do that all the time to sell a business, but I
It's
don't.
commercially reasonable, no, you wouldn't have to disclose it. And I'll say that if somebody wants to kind of like set up a situation or seeking advice, they can always come to us for advice and as to what is commercially reasonable. And they could also ask for a written advisory opinion to kind of like set the stage so that other people would have advice going forward. And I think that is actually it for changes.
Would that written advisory opinion use personally identifiable information or just the generic situation?
So they use a specific set of facts. Generally speaking, we're looking for a specific set of facts. However, we don't include person identifying information, only to the extent that the person is comfortable with it. So we don't include names, but if somebody is, comfortable with more personal details, like for example, where they're employed, then that is information that we would include if it's essential or if it helps with the advisory opinion. So generally speaking, I approach the person who's requested advisory opinion to ask them their level of comfort in terms of what information is going to be disclosed, but names are never disclosed.
And I wanted to, before we move on from this side-by-side summary document, I think TJ, you probably heard some of the conversation that we were having. Is there any additional context you wanted to put on before we move on to the language?
And I apologize, are you speaking of the Governor's Council and the comments there?
Yeah, and the conversation that you've heard so far on the, as we were going through just the kind of bullet points and the summary of the changes that are in the recommended language.
Yeah, and I thank you. I can put a couple of them in sort of larger context with other states. With respect to that investment question, this is really focused in on any single holding, even if it's in another account. For example, if you have a mutual fund, and within that mutual fund, you have a holding of an individual stock that's over $10,000, that would be reportable. And the reason that would be reportable is because in today's modern society, you essentially can set up your own bespoke mutual fund. And you can imagine somebody deciding to set up their own mutual fund where $15,000 worth is one stock and then $25 is another stock. So in technical terms, it's a mutual fund, but in reality, the individual stock is being held within the mutual fund where it takes up 95% of that fund. So that would be the reason that within funds, you may still have to disclose the individual holding, even if you don't have to disclose the fund. With respect to
Before you move on from that point, TJ, sorry, I just wanted to ask a question because this has been a real point of conversation both in the committee and outside of here where folks are like, oh my gosh, the tediousness of needing to figure out if I have a mutual fund, what's in it and how much, and that changes, and how would I, do that to fill out this form? It's not that folks are trying to hide anything, but it's goes to the sort of feasibility of us entering into this. And I'm wondering if we could get at that sort of edge case of the bespoke mutual fund by making a distinction between, you know, funds that the disclosure, the public servant controls versus ones that they don't. Because I just would want us to sort of get at the thing we're trying to get at and not require every single disclosure across all of state government to have to go to their financial advisor and get a list of everything that was in every mutual fund, when I just don't think that would be a very reasonable thing for us to do.
No, and that is one way to address that issue. Other states, I think I explained last time around, a lot of states are dealing with this right now because everybody just has a lot more investment and there's a lot more investment vehicles out there. Some states have addressed this by specifically exempting certain types of account, whether they're run by the individual or run by somebody else. For example, states have explicitly exempted retirement accounts from this disclosure, irrespective of whether one of the stocks within the retirement accounts is worth, $100,000 for a particular stock. Others have exempted ETFs or exchange traded funds from the disclosure requirement, irrespective of whether any single holding is over $10,000 or not. So that's the other way that some other states have addressed this. But certainly if the committee wanted to look at those funds where the filer does not control any of the trades within the funds, that's another way to address the same problem.
All right, I think that may be the place where we end up doing significant wordsmithing before we can see the next draft of the bill.
There was one other thing I wanted to mention that I'm recognizing that there's a large concern, as there is other places, of disclosing the names of clients. And I wanted to flag that for purposes of the current language, this would only apply to those who are self-employed. It wouldn't apply to disclosing clients in a business context. And the reason for that is this attempts to get at those clients who there may not be any other disclosure mechanism. For example, if somebody was self-employed and taking cash payment for services, which is completely legitimate, but it otherwise wouldn't be disclosed on, say, a 1099 form. So other than this disclosure mechanism, that would go undisclosed. And so the way you certainly don't want to sweep in, those small amounts of payments that you may receive from clients, which is why the focus is on the threshold of a certain amount of money, high enough that you don't sweep in all the smaller payments that might be being made. And the second is that the concept of state business, and the committee raised the legitimate concern of that quote unquote state business that may not be impactful at all. And there are ways to address that as well. The first would be to address it with the idea of a known business relationship or a known business contract that the client may have. And the second is to make it significant only for contracts that the client has over a certain dollar amount, or contracts that the client is seeking from the state.
Okay, questions about that? I think we'll take those notes, and then as we look at the language, try to make sure we're advising legislative council on what the flavor of what the committee would like to see in the next drafts. That makes sense to everybody. Great. So why don't we turn our attention to the next handout? And so, Chris, what would be the best thing for us to be looking at this point here?
To be honest, this is a more detailed explanation of the changes. So what we've done is we pulled out all of the language that indicates a change and given the explanation for the rationale behind the change. And so it might be good to maybe start where someone is concerned and just, take time to review the additional information that we provided. I think some of that has already been discussed. But generally, we're just, stating the reason behind the change, for example, the income disclosure, ensures public trust and the public servant is not beholden to private interest. So that's the philosophical rationale behind it. And then kind of taking a look at what other states do and what this might look like in reality. So maybe it's best to look at those areas where people are most concerned or have concerns first.
So, so we're looking at the language chart. Now, do you think that that would be the best place for us to?
Yes, the one that says explanation of recommended financial disclosure changes and the orange is highlighting where there's been a change.
This is the first document.
Oh, yeah. So if we were starting with disclosure of client names, so I can just read through it. Income disclosure is important for public trust, particularly when the public servant is indirectly receiving private income from the state, where the public servant's private clients also have business dealings with the state. There's an increased risk that the public will be concerned about the client using the relationship to gain preferential treatment. Disclosure helps ensure public confidence that an official's private clients are not using the official to get contracts or other benefits for the state. So not necessarily limited to contracts. It also helps public servants identify business relationships that may give rise to conflicts of interest. Many states, including Massachusetts, require disclosure of the names of all clients above a certain threshold, irrespective of whether they have state business. The commission believes that such an expansive rule will be less effective in Vermont, but recognizes the trust in government is served by disclosing private clients. They also have state business. Many states in the Northeast, such as Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, require disclosure of clients, the filer or the filer's family members, or an associated business also has dealings with the state. So it wouldn't be breaking new ground here. And we do recognize that this is, a new concept. So we wouldn't be looking to set the bar as, the highest level. I mean, the lowest level, we're looking to set a higher bar. So it's a more limited disclosure than other states around us have.
So TJ was talking about how the way we have the language drafted now, a person who was a private attorney would have to disclose their clients who had business before the state.
Yeah, and I think
But like if I'm a salesperson for a company and I report my W-2 income as that company, I don't have to go into that company's records and go, oh, who are all the clients that might have business before the state that.
Yeah, I think we're looking at two of the proposed changes as well. So like number one, if the attorney isn't required, if it's confidential information that the attorney isn't required to disclose, is protected under law, then they wouldn't be required to disclose it. Number two, you're talking about known business. So you're talking about a situation, say you're representing your client before the state, you're going to know, right? Your client may have other business interests that you know nothing about. So if you don't know about them, then you wouldn't be disclosing them.
Any questions about that recommendation?
And I think another way to approach it would be if you're concerned about the definition of business or how it's being defined here, if we think it's too broad. For example, when we're looking at the state code of ethics and like conflict of interest rules, we do have, the exceptions there. For example, if it's something that's purely administrative. So we're talking about somebody who's applying for a driver's license with the state. So that would clearly not fall under the definition of, business with the state. So you could build that out a bit more and use, I think, the conflict of interest rules and state code of ethics to help you build out that definition, at least in terms of what would be excluded from a definition.
And I think we talked a little bit about the self-employed language, and I think Representative Higley brought up a bit of a concern and wondering about and one of the ways I'm wondering if we can solve that, and maybe this also goes for the particular stock issue, is to think about what the reasonable threshold is for us in Vermont. You know, is somebody going to be, is $10,000 the right number? $10,000 isn't what it used to be. And so I don't think we need to have this whole debate now, but I think that one of the policy choices that, as we're discussing this moving forward, should be, you know, is there kind of a reasonable place where we feel like the disclosure makes sense because that amount really could have a reasonable influence over someone's behavior. And if the $10,000 number is the right one, I've certainly have been approached by folks who are like, gosh, if I had $10,000 in Apple, who cares? Like, I'm not gonna, like, what does that mean? That's not, and then on the other hand, I think many of us don't have a problem disclosing what our holdings are, who our clients are. So I think that is a policy lever that we need to make a choice about.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly one way to handle it. And I think when we're looking at, whether the person is self-employed or employed by a company who has clients and do business for the state, you're looking at the potential for the direct impact on that person's income, right? So if you have a client and they're a significant client and they're doing business with the state, then their financial interests may be tied to the business that they have with the state, which may more directly impact you versus you're working for a company and your company has clients that have business with the state. What is the path that providing them favors is going to directly, affect you and your income? So we're talking about the directness of the relationship. It's not saying it couldn't happen when you're a W-2 employee. Like certainly your boss could give you pressure to do something, but there's more, it's still indirect, but it's more of a direct path. I think if you're self-employed and you have a small number of clients who depend on your income, so.
And I think we've probably beat the investment income piece to death a little bit in here, but is there anything else we should be thinking about as we work with, to come up with a?
No, I would just agree with the idea that you could probably address that through language. And if you want to get at this bespoke mutual fund, and you do want to keep ahead of, advances that are happening, in the financial world and how people might try and get around rules. So I do think if you, had language regarding, traditional mutual fund, which you have control over what goes into it versus, a more bespoke mutual fund, that is potentially going to hopefully alleviate those concerns.
Yeah, I think probably the broadest way to capture what we're looking at is to something to the effect of that the public servant who's making the disclosure has control over that. I don't know. And see, at legislative council, that may be a harder thing to capture than, but I definitely don't want to, I think from what I've heard from the committee, I don't think we want to have language in the version that we pass out here that would require anybody disclosing to have to go to their financial advisor every time they do their disclosure and get a detailed list of every single piece of a mutual fund that is a generally available, index or mutual fund that's out there in the, in the market. If they just say, I've got this amount of mutual funds, that kind of does it for me, unless the kind of thing where they are actually creating a custom bespoke mutual fund and they control, a handful of stocks that are in that. That's a little bit different.
And I don't want to be too simplistic, but I do wonder if that's one way to address it. Just, say traditional mutual funds don't need to disclose bespoke mutual funds or funds in which, the filer has control over, do need to disclose something like that. And there's always the option, we're developing a common understanding here. So there's always the option for someone to come to the ethics commission and ask for an advisory opinion about what needs to be disclosed. And then we'll have that posted for, future written guidance for everyone. So.
We talked pretty in depth about the boards and commission disclosure piece before, but does anybody have any other questions about that? Not changing anything about ownership interest in a business, but ownership interest in a business that does business with the state.
Yeah, when we're defining business, I mean, this has come up, when we're assessing the code of ethics, not necessarily business, but like how broadly do you interpret terms that may look, a bit ambiguous on paper? There is case law out there. There's, we do look at other states. We're giving guidance or drafting advisory opinions. We look at how other states define it. So there's a common understanding at what you're trying to get at, and that you're not trying to get at, business with the state means that, I have a driver and the driver applies for, driver's license. We're not looking at those situations. We're really trying to get at business with the states. Contracts, there's a direct financial interest really between your business and the business that they're doing with the state. So although not every term is defined, fully in statute, which is the case with everything, there is a common understanding out there of what that means and what that doesn't mean. And we're always there to help people, like guide them through that thinking, or again, post an advisory opinion.
Sections, okay. I'm reading through the associated business loans piece that's next. Do folks have questions about this? Because it's one of the things where I feel like it's a really narrow application. So it probably would affect only a very, very few number of disclosures. I don't
And also here,
understand it, but I wanted to see if folks have questions about it.
Also here, we're talking about, loans that are not commercially reasonable. This is already something that's prohibited by gift rules, right? So really here, it's helping people, it's flagging for people what they need to be aware of. And we really are looking at something that's not commercially reasonable. So if you could get something on the open market, and we're not just talking about, you get a personal loan from a family member, and, they're doing you, well, that's not the best example. We're talking about, a personal note. We're talking about something that is not commonly done, and you're getting extremely favorable terms. And then you have to have a combination of those two things. And so if somebody is, disclosing a loan that is not commercially reasonable here, then that's a flag for them that maybe something is actually going on that is already prohibited under the law. And so this is helping them identify those situations. And when I say under law, I'm talking about the gift rules for once somebody's in office.
Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. Is there outlined somewhere clearly what commercially reasonable means?
Not in the statute currently, but again, there's like a common understanding what it is, and TJ might be more familiar with how it's defined in other states or.
Sure. The threshold question is whether, but for your state position, would these same terms be offered? This became a sort of cause du jour about 25 years ago, when Countrywide Financial, which was a huge mortgage lender, decided it was going to offer federal senators essentially 0% loans on any real estate that they wanted to buy. And it was, those loans were not offered to anybody else. And the presumption was they were being offered to senators because of their position and because Countrywide had a lot of business in front of the Senate at the time. So this caused states to go back to try to figure out how to not prohibit this if they weren't previously prohibited by state. The federal government obviously changed their rules, and the states tried to figure out ways to address the same issue. And I can't underscore enough that businesses can take loans on whatever the best terms they can get are. The issue here is the focus on the lender and the lender's attempt to use that to curry favor with the public official. And so the solution is, to the extent that it's not forbidden, to just make sure that that is disclosed. But again, the threshold test is, but for the filer's position, would the same terms be offered? Could another person who's not a state official come in with the exact same circumstances and get the exact same loan? And if
And I
not,
think-
it's not commercially reasonable.
I think we're also looking at this in the context of candidates, right? So it's a little bit of a different analysis there. And so since we are asking this information of candidates, it is a way to identify situations that might give rise to a conflict of interest if that person were to, obtain a position that they're running for. And so once you've received we'll call it preferential treatment from someone, is that going to leave you open to accusations of conflict of interest or, preferential treatment when that same person comes before you, or you're acting on an issue that affects that person? So that's how the disclosure is going to, be beneficial in terms of candidates' disclosure, because we're not just talking about people who are disclosing once they're in office. And again, this is, this helps people avoid certain situations. So say you may not be thinking about that particular loan, until you're in office, and then it comes before you, it's flagged for you in your mind. You realize that you are being asked to act on a matter that relates to the person or entity that gave you that loan. Now it's flagged for you. You can now recuse yourself or address it in some other manner.
There's no change in leases or contracts with the state that's already required. So the spouse or domestic partner piece, I appreciate the specificity here that in a way, you already have to disclose who your spouse or domestic partner is, but this is just making it clear that, and again, it's only candidates for state office. So, governor, secretary of state, et cetera, not the General Assembly that have to file their 1040s.
Is that true or not true?
Well, right now, disclosure of the spouse or domestic partner's name is required, of people running for state office because when they file their 1040, but this would expand disclosure to everyone.
Right, so everybody would have to disclose the name, but
Right.
not their 1040s.
Yes.
I
The
think,
1040 disclosure does not change from current practice in this bill, and it won't, that we're not passing
but you
that.
just said statewide office. You said not state representative.
Exactly, so just to be clear, currently, and in this draft, statewide office seekers have to disclose both their domestic partner and their 1040. The only change for those folks running for the General Assembly in this draft, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you'd have to disclose who your spouse or domestic partner was, but there's no requirement for somebody seeking office for state representative or state senate to disclose their tax documentation.
And I thought you just said not, that wasn't true. So I'm confused.
So now candidates for statewide office have to file their tax return, and they can redact some information, but the name of their spouse or domestic partner is likely going to be on the tax form, so they're disclosing it that way. So this would change to make disclosure of a candidate or executive officer's spouse or domestic partner that apply to everyone, but there'd be no change when it comes to filing tax returns.
Does that clear that up?
No. Sorry.
So the only new piece of information that a candidate for the legislative offices would have to disclose is just the name of their spouse and domestic partner if we pass this bill. Doesn't change anything about who has to disclose a redacted 1040. That currently is only statewide office seekers, and that would stay the same. We're not expanding who has to file their tax information with this bill. That doesn't change at all with this bill.
That wasn't what I read here, but maybe I'm reading it wrong.
We'll be taking another look at this draft. So if there if questions remain, there will be other opportunities for us to talk about this. Because what I'm hoping to do is have us all take a look at these documents, give feedback to legislative council. I think there's already a new draft in the works with some of the things that we had raised flags about last time and some of the feedback we'd gotten from Chris. So the next time we take this up, which I think we'll do next Wednesday, Wednesday's Ethics Day, I think, in our committee, we'll look at some of those recommendations. But if folks have other concerns or questions that they want in the meantime, I think, speak with me, speak with Director Sivert, talk to Legislative Council. Representative Waters Evans has done a bunch of work on this too, so she may be able to clear some things up. Great. Well, I think,
You want me to go over the comments about the language, or is that something you'll just circulate internally?
yeah, do you want to just probably have the last couple of minutes here, want to hit the highlights on some of those changes? We'll go through them once we have a draft bill to look at, but.
Sure. So I think they're fairly short, but we just had a couple of comments on language that, have recently occurred to us. So we're talking about the training requirements. I think as the language is written now, only municipal officers who are currently in their positions would have to take the training, and only once. And there's also seems to be some sort of opt-out where they've taken another form of training already, then they wouldn't have to do it. So our suggestion would be that, this is a recurring requirement, and it's something that everyone has to take within 120 days of, the start of their service. And that's to their benefit, so that they understand the municipal code of ethics, the new laws. And that would also make it, we object to the opt-out in the sense that we really think the training needs to include the specific training on the municipal code of ethics. And we also suggested that within the training, because even just in the last few days, we've gotten several calls, complaint inquiries about municipal ethics, and there is a lot of concern about open meeting law and public records law. So another suggestion that we would have, and this is also based on, our conversation last week, that there's sections that relate to compliance with state public records law and state open meeting law, and potentially the Secretary of State's office would want to weigh in and improve that section of the training or develop it themselves, and we can include it in all-in-one training. Because I think it does specify 2 hours of training. Currently, our code of ethics training is about 45 minutes to an hour. So if we're going to build that out, then I think that those would be appropriate areas in which to build out the training.
Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. I remember when we were talking about this last year, it was the state police training or something. Do you remember we went from like a required number of hours to just completing a program? And I'm wondering if that would be something that we could consider for this, just because.
Yeah, I think I like where you're going. So I think what the recommendation is less about the hours and more about making sure it's the state or the municipal code of ethics training that's actually been either created or approved by the State Ethics Commission. I like the suggestion of it not being about the hours, but that it be a specific training and the whole training that was provided by or approved by the State Ethics Commission. Is that a change that you're comfortable with? I like the alignment with some of the other work that we're done around competency versus the number of hours.
Right.
Does that seem acceptable to you?
Yeah, I think the content is the most important thing. Yeah. And so we wouldn't want people to be taking ethics training that didn't include specific training on the municipal code of ethics, because it is to their benefit. They need to understand what the new law is and how to comply with it. So we want to make sure people get that training.
Or what if, by the time you come up with all the sort of elements that are important, it is longer than 2 hours, then.
We would very much try not to make it longer than 2 hours, because I think people will, the last hour and 15 minutes, people will be clicking through rather.
Sure.
But yeah, sure, it can be longer than 2 hours. And especially if we added in open meeting law and public records law training, because I'm starting to feel like that is equally important information for people to get. And I'm not sure what training people get now, at least not required training anyway. So I think it would be helpful. So their office, when we get complaints about municipalities, they tend to come together. So conflicts of interest and preferential treatment generally go hand in hand with open meeting law and occasionally public records law. And we are getting more complaints about potential financial irregularities and citizens trying to look into those issues on their own and being stymied by lack of compliance with public records law. So I think that is another area to pay attention to as well. And moving on to definitions. So I think in the current definition of retaliate or retaliation, it's limited to employees, municipal employees. And I don't think the intent was to limit the whistleblower protections to just municipal employees, but to include the general members of the public as well, because certainly that's who we're hearing from the most when it comes to retaliation. As I said in the past, a couple of weeks, I've gotten a number more phone calls related to municipal issues, and each person has raised the issue of retaliation. So we just have some suggested language changes here, either to expand the definition of retaliation or include two separate definitions, one for municipal employees and another specific to the public. So those are suggestions that we. And candidates for state money.
On that point, give me an example of a retaliation to a member of the public. I mean, if they're not working for the municipality or have any, connection to it, what retaliation could there be?
Sure. So I have a recent example of someone who said they complained to the select board about a couple of issues. And then somebody who works for the municipality has been coming by their house and parking outside up to 4 times a day. And then using the excuse that, they're Miss Employee, so they're allowed to drive around, do what they want. But they felt like it was clearly an attempt to intimidate. We had another person who said that they're interested to know what the whistleblower laws were because she's somebody who's looking into financial irregularities, and they know people who have, after speaking up, have experienced vandalism and other types of things. Somebody said that once they spoke up, they had repeated what they characterize as false complaints made to a law enforcement agency about something that's happening on their property. And they're always anonymous complaints. And then law enforcement, came out and has said to them, we understand these are fake complaints. These are anonymous complaints and they're fake. We keep coming out. We're going to have to do something about this soon. In other cases, like we haven't had a specific call, but the idea is if somebody is, bidding on a contract and they're complaining, they've submitted a complaint about a separate issue, then they feel like they might be the best candidate for the contract, but the contract may go to somebody else because in retaliation for them complaining about a separate ethics issue or even a related ethics issue. So those are the things, some of the things that come up.
Thanks.
Yeah. There are more examples. Some of them are mine, but if you want more, I can probably give you, I can actually just kind of look at some of the complaints that have come into our office the past year or so and come up with more examples of things that people have brought up. So, okay. When it comes to the financial disclosure forms, our suggestion was to add language saying that the clients need to be known, the client's business with the state or municipality or state need to be known to the candidate or the candidate's spouse or domestic partner to trigger the disclosure requirement, and that information that's confidential under law does not need to be disclosed, so specifying that here. Again, related to disclosure form, something that we have not discussed before, but under the definition of investments described as investment income. So this question has arisen recently from somebody who's filling out disclosure form, and they wanted clarification on whether they needed to include money they were using from the sale of stocks that they sold at a loss, but they were using for income versus only disclosing money where they'd actually gained, where they had capital gains. And so we think in line with other states, we can specify that if you have a loss, you don't need to report it, but if you have a gain, then you do. And again, related to the disclosure form, so we think that the definition of county office should line up with the other definition, the currently existing definitions of county office or county officer. So if you look at, for example, the Secretary of State's website, those that need to file with the Secretary of State when it comes to county office include assistant and side judges and high bailiffs. They're currently excluded from the definition of county office. But again, the financial disclosure requirement is a part of the candidate filing process. And so generally speaking for disclosure, we don't think there should be exceptions, but specifically when we're talking about what someone needs to do to file for office, we don't think an exception for assistant or side judges and high bailiffs are warranted here. And I know in the past, moving on to investigations, hearings, and recommendations, I know in the past there's been concern about people using or abusing the Ethics Commission by filing frivolous complaints. So we would suggest adding a provision that explicitly prohibits the filing of frivolous complaints. And that's just a simple statement that no person shall knowingly and willfully make a false or frivolous complaint under this chapter.
Well, I think we're gonna have to break there because we're a little over for lunch. So definitely want to keep working on this. We'll be back at it next week.